And I would say, in a quite stable position of my life. I was working in advertising. But my biography is really complicated. When you hear that I'm adopted, most people assume that I was adopted as a baby, because most people, you know, they don't know their biological parents when they're adopted. But in my case, it was different. I was given up for adoption when I was 7 years old. 7 years old. So for the first 7 years of my life, I lived in an orphanage. I lived in a Catholic orphanage first, and I grew up under the care of nuns, Catholic nuns. And when I was 3 years old, I came to a foster family. So the family eventually adopted me when I was 7. But for the first 7 years of my life, in the complicated situation that I was in, I knew my biological mother and my biological grandmother because they would visit me sporadically. We've been always in contact. This is really important also for me for you to understand if you continue with the story and how I actually had to work things through. So at that point, when I was 38 and when I was in the library, I already had an identity. I had life before. I was almost 40 years old. So the discovery came as a complete shock because I didn't know anything, really anything about my family's biological or my biological family's historical past. I had no clue about it.
First of all, really essential for the answer, for the open and the candid.
My biological grandmother, who is not alive anymore, was always complicated, and when I made the discovery, it got even more complicated. First, after the discovery, I was more occupied actually with Amon-Gerd because the figure was so monstrous. So monstrous. So until I really thought about my relationship with my grandmother and really went into details, finding out more about my mother, there were a period where I was not really able to think logically. You know, I was really in complete shock. It was a situation where I was one day in front of my mirror, in my bathroom, in my house, and I was only thinking about Amon-Gerd. You know, because I remember that I was looking at the mirror and I was asking myself if I carry something of Amon-Gerd within me. And this was really scary and petrifying. And I remember that I found a similar line in my face that looked a bit similar like him. And this was difficult for me because I didn't want it to look like him. And I asked myself if I carry something of him within me. Of course, you know, today I can think rationally and logically. Just because we have something similar in our face, it doesn't say anything about who I am, about my character. But at that point, I was very frightened. So before I could really think about my mother and the relationship with my grandmother, I had, you know, to work through the monstrous figure of Amon-Gerd. But once somehow I understood that, you know, I am so different, I would never be able to kill someone. I mean, we all know about the cruelty. Amon-Gerd had 2 dogs that he trained. And he trained these dogs to kill people. This is so far from whatever I think anyone in the room can imagine. And I just knew that I'm different. But it was a very different story with the 2 women in my family, because I feel somehow more, you know, I identified more with them. My mother is the 2nd generation, and my mother always felt a tremendous feeling of guilt. If you would see my mother, I don't know if you saw me when I came in here, you know, I can walk upright. It was difficult, but I somehow was able to come out on the other side, you know, make something good out of something bad. But if you look at my mother, you feel like she's carrying still a lot of weight on her shoulders. So it's a different generation, it's the 2nd generation, I'm the 3rd generation. So the relationship with my mother became very complicated. First of all, because she's so different, but also because there were a lot of different feelings involved. You know, at the very beginning, Dina, I was very, very, very angry with my mother. Because I couldn't understand, this is something so profound that I think you have to tell your child. And not only that, my mother never told me, you know, the book that I found, she didn't mention me. It was like I never existed. So there were a lot of negative feelings and feelings of anger towards my mother in the beginning. But once, you know, I had therapy and I really needed help. It's not something that you can work through by yourself. I had the help of a really, really good therapist who also worked with survivors. He was really someone who was from the university, he's very good. So with working on these issues with someone who could help, I understood my mother, and I understood that my mother is not only my mother, my biological mother, but that she herself is also a woman with a very, very difficult life and past herself. You know, being the daughter of Amon Gerd is nothing I ever wished someone. And her whole life, even though she didn't know him, you know, she was born a year after, no, actually she was born a year before he was executed. He was executed after the war, very close to Krakow, by hanging. My mother never knew him, but the identification with your own parents is something, even though someone is not alive, that you will carry for the rest of your life. So once I understood my mother's situation, and I really understood that she herself is carrying a very difficult heritage, I could feel empathic towards my mother, and we were able to build a relationship. For a certain time, my mother, unfortunately, decided, we met each other, you know, not immediately after the discovery. 1.5 years passed, they had to work things through aloud. But eventually, when we met and we had contact, I was able to meet her because I wanted to have a relationship, not a reckoning. So after a year, unfortunately, my mother decided to cut ties again. I don't really know why. I think there are a lot of reasons why. One of the reasons is probably, and now we come to my grandmother, to my biological grandmother, the relationship between my mother and her mother, my biological grandmother, was very intense, symbiotic, and difficult. And my mother always said to me that I so much are like my grandmother, that I remind her so much of my grandmother. Small things, you know, the way we dress, that I normally carry a handbag that fits my shoes. This is something, you know, it's simple, but she also said the way we talk, the way we structure our language, it's very much alike. And if you know that my grandmother lived next to Amon Gerd in a concentration camp, this is not really a compliment. So my mother, I think, you know, because I also remind her of my grandmother, was not able to keep the relationship between the two of us. So the relationship now, to come to my grandmother, with my grandmother, was something that I had to solve by myself. My grandmother committed suicide when I was 12 years old. I didn't know at that point. I knew that she passed away because my adoptive parents had seen in the newspaper there was a notification. So I always knew that she passed away, but I didn't know anything about the circumstances. I will explain it a bit, because you have to know that my grandmother committed suicide the same night, or actually hours, after she gave an interview to a journalist about Oskar Schindler. And she talked about the war, she talked about what was happening, and she took her life with an overdose of sleeping pills the night after the interview. So I could never, you know, the relationship with my grandmother was more theoretical relationship. I couldn't talk to her after I discovered who she was. I say who she was because it's so complicated and it's so deep. You know, I knew my grandmother when I was a little child. Last time I've seen my grandmother, I was 7 years old. And I truly, truly liked my grandmother. She was really someone that I liked as a child. I had very, very positive memories of her. And suddenly, when I read the book that I discovered in the library, and when I found out that she was not only my grandmother, but also a woman, you know, who was capable of living with a man like not even perhaps she did love him. This was so difficult for me to grasp and to understand, and she was like a woman with two faces for me. Like a woman who had two different identities, and I just couldn't bring it together. And the complicated thing for me was not only that I had these feelings that I didn't know where to put the love, because if I would admit to the love, would it mean that I closed my eyes like my grandmother did? So this was the one conflict. But the second conflict was also my grandmother, because I'm so much like her, I asked myself the question, how would I have behaved? You know, of course, I knew I would never kill someone like Amon-Gerd. I would never have dogs to kill people. I would never, ever be capable of this. But the position of my grandmother, you know, not being such an innocent bystander, she was not convicted after the war. This was something that raised a lot of questions. My position, how would I have behaved? And this made it very, very, very complicated.
How the discovery changed or shaped your attitudes to your mother and your grandmother, and you definitely answered that. I would only dwell in one more half a sentence. When I read your book,
and very often, you know, if you want to get an explanation, you go back and you study the childhood, maybe you find a trauma or whatsoever. So with Amon-Gerd, I couldn't find anything. He was born in Vienna. He had a quite normal childhood, a normal upbringing. He was a single child. His parents had a very small publishing house. He was raised by his parents, also by a distant aunt. There was nothing, you know, that would give you a hint why he became so sadistic. So my explanation is, and it's an explanation that is maybe a very specific explanation for Amon-Gerd, is that in his specific case, it was a combination of the ideology of the time, that actually it was a state, this was a state ideology. It doesn't make it any better. So he could perfectly, his own character, bring into the ideology, but he had probably also some psychopathic or sociopathic disorder, I would say. But the average German, they did an experiment, as you probably all know, after the war, the Milgram experiment. It was done in the United States after the war. I think it was done by Yale University, because they wanted to find out why do people become perpetrators. And it was an experiment. It's too complicated really to explain it into detail. But what they found out is that people, it was an experiment that was done, I have to add this, with average people, like really average people, like you and me, normal people, yeah? And what they found out is that people, people follow authorities, they follow orders. When they get orders in their specific case, they just stop using their brain. They stop, you know, thinking about moral values. And this is something that makes it so dangerous. So when I also speak about these things, or if I teach or if I give speeches, I really want people to understand that these people like Amon-Gerd, they're very dangerous. But what is even more dangerous is the masses of people who follow these leaders. People who just stop using their own brain, who follow authorities. This is, I would say, even the bigger, the greatest danger. And if you look back at Nazi Germany, Hitler, it was not that he took the power by force. No, the power was given to Hitler by people. They gave him the power. And if I look now to the United States, relate what's going on with people like Trump or person like Trump, I'm really frightened. I'm very frightened. And it's not, I'm not laughing about it anymore. I mean, Hitler said what he was going to do. And still people voted for him, they elected him. Hitler was given the power, and it's the people who support these leaders. This is the real danger, and this actually the Milgram experience shows it really, really well. Yeah. So if you don't know it, I recommend you look it up.
It started.
I will also give you a long answer. Well, because it's also actually a question that raises. I don't have an answer, but. Was it coincidence or was it fate? I came to Israel in the first place without knowing anything about my family's past. It was very simple. After I finished high school, I lived in Paris. I studied in Paris and I met a girl, and her name is Noah. I write about her in the book. Actually, I spent the day with her. We had a wonderful morning and we went together when the sirens were. So I met Noah in Paris. And she went back to Harvard because she was only as an exchange student in Paris. And she asked me if I would like to come and visit her one day. So I said, yes, why not? I come, and I came as a tourist to visit Noah, my friend. And when I was in Israel, it was something very surprising happened. As I said to you, I had an image of Israel. I had learned about the Holocaust, about the Nazi past in school. I had, of course, followed Israel in the media. I knew about the Palestinian conflict. So I had a very, I would say an image about Israel in my head. I thought somehow it was a kind of dark place with more elderly people. The Holocaust, everything, I thought it was a very dangerous place. So when I first traveled to Israel, and I was in the beginning of my 20s, I was 20 or 19 years old, and I came to Israel. I remember when I landed at the airport, and I stepped onto the Holy Land. I was so surprised because it was not at all what I thought Israel would be like. And I fell in love immediately. I loved everything. I loved the architecture in Tel Aviv. I thought Jerusalem was fascinating. And I was traveling around in the country. I came to Eilat, and I was a very short period in the kibbutz. And when I was in Eilat, not only that I had lost my heart to Israel as a country, but classical story, I met a guy. And I fell in love with this guy. He was a Sabra. He was much older than I was. His parents were already born here in Israel, somewhere in the north. And it was a love story. So I actually stayed for this guy. But as things happen, he was much older, a lot of things. We didn't stay together, but I wanted to stay in Israel anyhow. So I started to study, and I lived here for more than 4 years, actually. I learned Hebrew. My Hebrew is still very good. You can speak to me. It's like a bit קשה לעשות את השינוי בראש שלי. So, but I lived here for a long time. And when I came back, you mentioned, Dina, that I was at the book fair last year when the book came out. I was really frightened a bit. How would it be to come back? Because when I came first to Israel, people received with open heart. I had lots of friends, and I felt very comfortable. And I didn't know how would people react to me if they would know that I'm also, and I say also, the granddaughter of Amon Gad, and which was so wonderful last year. The people received me really with so much interest and open arms and open hearts, and I met a lot of friends. A lot of survivors, after they heard about my story, started to contact me. And yesterday, as you said, my day yesterday was I rented out a car and I drove around the country to visit my friends. Like survivors who are, there are people who can't come tonight because it's just too difficult. And it's so wonderful to be back, to be in a position to speak to people and let them, because it's not just a small individual story. It is really, if I look at it from their perspective, it is really a symbolic story of reconciliation, that we can be together now as friends. And last year I've been in Haifa at an event with Tina. She's a survivor, one of the few survivors from the Schindler's List who is still alive. And last year when I was in Haifa for the university, I was sitting there with Tina, and Tina was holding my hand. I mean, you have to imagine, this is like living history, and it feels so right, and I feel so privileged. And today when the sirens went on, you know, what I was thinking about was, yesterday, since I spent the day with them, how is it for them, you know, do they feel at that specific moment? And then history becomes very, you know, history becomes not history, but then it's real, and it's very, very, very intense. And I know, you know, that it's somehow, it's not a calling, it sounds a bit pathetic, but I really know that